All right, folks, it's official. The U.S. is sending cluster bombs to Ukraine. Don't you feel safer now? Uh, the decision is quite a surprise to me because cluster bombs have long been maligned, and in fact, I remembered last year when Russia was accused of using cluster bombs in the war, how bad that was considered to be by everyone in the West. We were told this is why Putin is a war criminal. Cluster bombs are very bad, and I learned at the time about why cluster bombs were bad. For those of you unaware, it's called a cluster bomb because you drop one payload, but then it spreads out and it actually has a bunch of little bombs inside it. Who knows how many? I don't know, let's say 30 or 50 or something like that. You've got tons of these little tiny bombs, and it spreads out across a wide area after you drop the one bomb. And so instead of having one big boom in one single spot, you have a bunch of little booms across a wide area. It's like a shotgun bomb. And you would think, hey, this makes sense. It's more efficient to do it that way. You don't need a giant explosion all the time in one particular spot. If you're trying to take out a wide area, let's say level a neighborhood, because the cost of running a bulldozer all day, it would be too time consuming. You need to level this area and kill everyone, let's say in an entire zip code very quickly. This is a more efficient way of spreading it out. You don't have to drop as many bombs, you just drop a bunch of little bombs. Well, the problem with these cluster bombs is that not all of the little bombs explode when they get dropped. There is an error rate. You end up with some duds, or, well, I guess they're technically not duds because they can still go off. They just didn't detonate when they hit the ground. And so they're sitting there. And, it's in the middle of a battlefield, a war zone, and, they forget about it for years, and they get covered up by dirt and rain and sleet, and eventually, at some point, could be a month later, could be a year later, could be a decade later, could be many decades later, as we're learning from some of these conflicts. All of a sudden, a little child is wandering in a field picking daisies, and then all of a sudden they're blown to bits because they stumbled upon and happened to destabilize a cluster bomb that was waiting there. Or, maybe years later, someone is digging a hole, or they're doing some construction, and you've got a piece of equipment there. And these bombs go off eventually, but they don't all go off when they're dropped. There is supposed to be a very small error rate. The U.S. in its manufacture tries to minimize the error rate, and it can't be more than like a 1% error rate. So if they drop 100 cluster bombs, or 100 little clusters, little bits, 99 of them should detonate. But there is that 1% that doesn't, and now it's going to be more than 1%, because Biden, from what I saw, has signed an executive order essentially bypassing that regulation so that we can produce more cluster bombs for Ukraine without the same quality control. So we can produce them more quickly, and so sure, they're going to have a higher error rate, and the more bombs that are going out, the more cluster bombs you drop, the more unexploded little cluster bits you end up with, and it's like a minefield. So your first thought would be, gee, I thought that, the Biden administration wants to help save Ukraine. Why would they want to use these weapons that will leave a lasting effect on Ukraine, that will be injuring and killing and maiming people for decades to come in the aftermath of the war once things are settled? If Ukraine is dropping all these cluster bombs on eastern Ukraine, land that we're told they're supposed to be taking back, that they are going to recover from the Ruskies, well, then poor Ukrainian citizens, decades from now, will still be dealing with the aftermath. They're going to be stepping on these bombs. They're going to be getting blown to bits by unexploded ordnance. And so why would anyone do this to their own country? Why would the U.S. help someone do this to their own country? Well, I think that the short answer is they've accepted that these parts of Ukraine are never going to be a part of Ukraine ever again, and that they are going to permanently be Russian. So they don't really care what happens to them. They don't really care if decades from now they're still dealing with unexploded bombs that they have damage, and that people generations from now will still be suffering because of these bombs. They don't care, because the regime in Kiev knows, and has always known, that these people in the East are more Russian than Ukrainian, and that's why they don't value their lives to begin with. And so the Biden administration and the regime in Kiev, they don't care even if they regard this as a war crime, which the U.S. is not a party to whatever it's called, the Treaty on Cluster Bombs, because the U.S. likes to use cluster bombs, so they never signed that treaty. A lot of Western countries have signed it, though. And so the U.S. is happy to call it a war crime when other countries, like Russia, use cluster bombs. When asked yesterday, though, why, at this point, the U.S. is changing its stance and sending cluster bombs to Ukraine, when that's something that has not been done up until now, President Biden responded that it's because we're out of ammunition, implying that these are all the bombs that we have left. In that the U.S. was prioritizing not sending cluster bombs. They were avoiding it. They were sending regular bombs, just normal other forms of conventional weapons. I think cluster bombs still classify as conventional weapons because they're not nuclear. But they were sending other types of conventional weapons, singular bombs, missiles, and whatnot. But according to Biden, we're out of ammunition. So now we're going to have to just delve into the cluster bomb stockpile and start shipping those out. And that's also why he had to sign that executive order loosening the production standards for cluster bombs, so that the cluster bombs are even more dangerous and less reliable. Now, do I believe that the U.S. is actually out of ammunition? I find that hard to believe. I don't think that neither the U.S. nor Russia will run out of ammunition. We see this constantly. Since the beginning of this war, we've been told, oh my gosh, the Russians are burning through all their resources. They can't produce things fast enough. They can't produce enough tanks because Ukraine is just capturing them at such a high rate. And they're wasting all their bombs. They're going to run out of bombs. There's no more missiles in Russia. They're all gone. They can only produce 10 missiles a week, but they're firing 100 of them. We've been hearing this since the beginning of the war. Russia never runs out of ammo, believe it or not. The old heart of the Soviet Union knows how to produce weapons. That's the one thing that you always could give the communists. That's the one thing that they could make reliably and oftentimes better than the West. They could just churn out millions and millions of AKs and RPKs and Makarovs and RPG-7s and Dragunovs, and they were all pretty excellent, easy to use, very reliable. They did the same thing with nuclear weapons. So everything from the smallest small arm, the Makarov, all the way up to nuclear warheads, the Ruskies knew how to produce weapons in large quantities, and they knew how to produce reliable weapons. And the U.S., likewise, produced high quantities of weapons. We saw this during World War II. Now, unfortunately, as nature of our very highly corrupted capitalist system, we do not produce the most inexpensive weapons. We produce by far the most expensive weapons, very complicated and high-priced, overpriced even for what they are. They're not the most complicated things in the world. We're not churning out millions of Lugers or anything like that have to be hand-fitted. But our weapons, on average, are going to cost more and be more complex and a little more temperamental than your average Russian weapon. That's comes down to a difference in design philosophy. The weapons companies in the U.S. are trying to design something that will make them the most amount of money, that will cost the most to produce, but will still do the job so that they get the contract. If the U.S. really was running out of ammunition, I think that the military would be all over Congress begging for more money, and Congress would be happily handing it out. I think that we would be building new weapons factories to fuel the war in Ukraine if we truly were running out. So I don't see it. It might still be true. I mean, this is, again, from the horse's mouth. This is Joe Biden himself. But, you know, sometimes you just have to take what he says with a few heavy pinches of salt. However, I think that this might be partially true. The sentiment might be correct. It might be that the U.S. actually is burning through so much of these weapons that they have been sending that they just want to send them a different type of weapon. Because it is making a noticeable dent, but I doubt that the U.S. would allow the stockpiles of the weapons that they've been sending, dwindle to nothing, to where they literally are out. So I think that about sums up the situation. The war in Ukraine not going well for the United States. Obviously not going, fantastic for Russia. Since the war is still going on, Russia would have liked this to have been a very quick war. But, when the U.S. essentially just keeps pouring gasoline on the fire, the fire keeps burning. So with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.